Hey folks, Uncle Kender here. Got this in email, found a website. The Complete Military History of France. This is very funny and oh so true. We're going to go through the list of wars that the French have fought and how they ended up. Stay with me here. It's going to go awful quick. Alright, way back in the day, the Gallic Wars, lost. In a war whose ending foreshadows the next 2,000 years of French history, France is conquered by, of all things, an Italian. Norse invasions, lost. King Charles the Simple buys peace with the Norsemen by giving them Normandy, hence the name. Moorish invasions, lost. Charlemagne scoots behind the Pyrenees. Third Crusade, Philip Augustus gets mad at Richard the Lionheart and goes home. The Seventh Crusade, lost. St. Louis' crusade to Egypt is resoundingly crushed. The Eighth Crusade, lost. St. Louis goes to Tunis. The 100 Years' War, mostly lost. Saved at last by a female schizophrenic, who inadvertently creates the first rule of French warfare, which is, France's armies are victorious only when not led by a Frenchman. The Italian Wars, lost. France becomes the first and only country to ever lose 2 wars when fighting the Italians. The Wars of Religion. France goes 0 wins, 5 losses, and 4 ties against the Huguenots. The 30-Year War. France is technically not a participant, but manages to get invaded anyway. Claims a tie on the basis that eventually the other participants start ignoring her. The War of Devolution. Tied. Frenchmen take to wearing red flower pots as chapeaux. St. Bartholomew Day Massacre, won because the opponent was also French. The Dutch War, tied. War of the Augsburg League, or King William's War, also known as the French and Indian War, lost but claimed as a tie. 3 ties in a row induces deluded frogophiles the world over to label this period as the height of French military power. The War of Spanish Succession, lost. The war also gave the French their first taste of a Marlboro, which they have loved ever since. Ba-dum-bump. American Revolution. In a move that will become quite familiar to future Americans, France claims a win, even though the English colonists saw far more action. This is later known as de Gaulle syndrome, and leads to the second rule of French warfare: France only wins when America does most of the fighting. This was part of a much larger worldwide war against the British, by the way, which the French lost since the Americans weren't participants. The French Revolution won primarily due to the fact that the opponent was also French. France introduces the world to the guillotine and the terror. The Quasi-War, tied. France, angry that the U.S. normalized relations with the British, seizes U.S. ships in the Caribbean and decrees war on American shipping worldwide. France conveniently ignores that the U.S. and France have a treaty of alliance that effectively makes the U.S. a subject state of France. American envoys in Paris are told they must pay a 250,000 franc bribe to the French foreign minister and a $10 million loan to France before the French will even consider negotiations. The Xyz Affair. U.S. refuses to pay, builds up a navy which promptly seizes 80 French ships, and continues to sue for peace. Delighted British offer aid to the U.S. against the French. Ends when Napoleon seizes power in Paris and abandons North America. Napoleon also agrees to abrogate the unequal treaty of alliance, making the U.S. truly independent for the first time, but it also produces the first rule of American diplomacy: you'll regret making any alliance with the French. The U.S. makes no other treaties of alliance for nearly 150 years. The Haitian Rebellion, lost. Loss marks the first defeat of a European army by African slaves, and produces the first rule of African warfare: we can always beat the French. The Napoleonic Wars, lost. Temporary victories, remember the first rule, due to the leadership of a Corsican, who ended up being no match for a British footwear designer. India, lost to the British. The Mexican Empire War, lost. Napoleon III takes advantage of the U.S. Civil War to invade Mexico. Don't ask me what he was thinking. Collapse of the Confederacy dashes plans to invade Louisiana. Saber-rattling by a reunified United States leads to a hasty French withdrawal. Is there any other kind? And leaving the puppet Austrian Emperor of Mexico to face a Mexican firing squad. The Franco-Prussian War, lost. Germany first plays the role of drunk frat boy to France's ugly girl home alone on a Saturday night. That's going to happen a lot. The Panama jungles, lost, this time to vegetation and mosquitoes. World War I, tied and on the way to losing, France is saved by the United States. Thousands of French women find out what it's like to not only sleep with a winner, but one who doesn't call her Fraulein. Sadly, widespread use of condoms by American forces forestalls any improvement in the French bloodline. World War II, first act, lost to the Germans. Conquered French liberated against their will by the United States and Britain just as they finished learning the Horst Wessel song. World War II, the second act, lost to the Italians. True, the Germans already had France on the ropes, but nevertheless, France is the first and only country to ever lose 3 wars when fighting Italians. World War II, the third act, won primarily due to the fact the opponent was also French, its Jewish population. Vichy government consistently gives Germans more than the Germans ask for when it comes to anti-Semitic policies. World War II, the fifth act, lost, this time to the Americans in North Africa. Ostensibly independent collaborationist Vichy government immediately occupied by Hitler, putting an end to the myth of unoccupied France. Vichy remains popular with the French people until it became clear that Germany was losing the war. World War II, the sixth act, reminiscent of the American Revolution. France claims a win, even though the British and Americans did all the work. Remember the second rule? Of liberating France, and the British, Americans, and especially the Russians did all the work of defeating Germany. France demands, and amazingly gets, a spot as one of the victorious allies, and even more amazingly gets a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. The War of Indochina Independence, lost. French forces plead sickness, take to bed with the Dien Bien flu. The U.S., forgetting the first rule of American diplomacy, steps into the mess and spends the next 20 years getting out. The War of Algerian Independence, lost after 8 brutal years of fighting. The loss marks the first defeat of a Western army by a non-Turkic Muslim force since the Crusades, and produces the first war of Muslim warfare. We can always beat the French. This rule is identical to the first rules of the Italians, the Russians, the Germans, the English, the Dutch, Spanish, Haitians, Vietnamese, and the Eskimos. The Ivory Coast conflict, on the way to losing. Remember the first rule of African warfare. The war on terrorism. France, keeping in mind its recent history, surrenders to the Germans and Muslims just to be safe. Attempts to surrender to the Vietnamese ambassador, but fails after he takes refuge in a McDonald's. With fond memories of its World War II third act victories, they form a new military alliance with Germany against the U.S. The 60th anniversary of D-Day. France repulses an invasion of elderly British veterans who seek to attend memorial services on the beaches of Normandy. October 2005. France passes a law making it mandatory for school textbooks to teach the French colonialism was positive. School programs recognize in particular the positive character of the French overseas presence, notably in North Africa. This provision is part of a law recognizing the national contribution of Frenchmen who colonized Algeria for 132 years and fought on the losing side of the War of Algerian Independence. See above. And today, the French government raises its terror alert level from run to hide. The only 2 higher levels in France are surrender and collaborate. The raise was precipitated by a recent fire, which destroyed one of France's white flag factories, disabling their military. Now, the question for any country silly enough to count on the French should not be, can we count on the French? But rather, how long until France collapses? This is Uncle Kinder with your daily bit of history.